6:22 a.m., May 14th, 2026. San Diego, California. 140 federal agents moved simultaneously across 6 zip codes. Estimated value of diverted defense payments, $134 million. The targets weren't warehouses or drug dens. They were 9 licensed yacht brokerages operating out of Shelter Island and Point Loma, businesses with framed licenses on their walls, FMC registration numbers on their letterheads, and OFAC compliance certifications filed annually without a single flag. The vessels in their transaction records were real. The buyers were real. The wire transfers were real. The money was real. The sales were not. What NCIS and the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit spent 7 months proving: 9 separate brokerage firms, operating independently on paper, had been processing defense procurement payments rerouted through yacht purchase escrow accounts. Cash diverted from a frozen $14 billion Taiwan arms sale, while Pentagon officials gave press briefings about diplomatic timelines and geopolitical priorities. The question agents couldn't initially answer wasn't how the money moved. It was who had designed a system sophisticated enough to survive 18 months of routine oversight without triggering a single automatic flag. That answer was buried in a footnote inside a contract audit submitted on a Thursday afternoon in March 2026, by a man most people in the building had never heard of. Glenn Pruitt had been reviewing defense contractor financials for 11 years. He worked out of a mid-level DCSA field office in Chula Vista, in a building that shared a parking lot with a dental supply company. His desk faced a window that looked onto a concrete retaining wall. He reviewed wire transfer documentation, cross-referenced payment routing records, and flagged anomalies. The kind of administrative work that produces hundreds of false positives per year and almost never surfaces anything significant. On March 6th, 2026, at 2:14 in the afternoon, he flagged something that wasn't a false positive. 6 wire transfers had arrived at 6 different San Diego brokerage accounts on the same afternoon, February 19th, 2026. Each transfer originated from a Taiwanese Defense Ministry subcontractor registered under the name Tianlong Marine Procurement Solutions. Each amount was $247,500. Each memo line read, "Vessel deposit escrow, pending registration." Pruitt had reviewed thousands of escrow arrangements over 11 years. He had never seen 6 synchronized international wire transfers arrive at 6 separate unrelated brokerages on the same afternoon, from the same overseas government subcontractor, each just under the $250,000 threshold that triggers an automatic currency transaction report escalation. He forwarded the flag to NCIS San Diego at 4:47 p.m. He included one line of annotation: clustering behavior inconsistent with standard commercial escrow practice. Recommend review. NCIS Special Agent Diane Colwell received the referral the following morning. She assigned it a preliminary case number and pulled 18 months of transaction records across all 6 brokerages. What she found would expand into one of the largest financial crimes investigations the San Diego field office had handled in a decade. But first, she needed to understand what she was actually looking at. The 9 brokerages involved in what would eventually be designated Operation Stillwater weren't hastily assembled shells. They were functioning businesses, some operating for more than 8 years, with real clients, real listings, and real employees who had no idea what was moving through the firm's escrow accounts. Pacific Meridian Yacht Sales had been operating out of a rented suite on Shelter Island Drive since 2018. Its owner, a former Navy logistics officer named Craig Benner, held a valid DoD vendor clearance and was on record as a preferred contractor for 3 separate naval procurement support programs. Benner had built a legitimate brokerage generating approximately $2, $3 million in genuine annual revenue. Alongside that legitimate revenue, starting in October 2024, his escrow accounts had begun receiving wire transfers from overseas entities. Transfers that arrived in patterns inconsistent with any actual vessel transaction. The money came in. A corresponding vessel was listed as sold in the brokerage's internal system. The vessel never moved. The buyer never took possession. 60 to 90 days later, the funds transferred outward to a series of holding accounts in the Cayman Islands. The same structure, with minor variations, was running across all 9 firms. I went through the case file reconstruction, and one detail kept pulling my attention. The vessels used in the fictitious transactions weren't random. They were real boats, registered in real names, with authentic documentation. Agents later determined that someone with access to California, DMV, and USCG vessel registration databases had assembled a catalog of dormant registrations. Boats that hadn't changed hands in years, whose owners wouldn't notice if their vessel appeared in a secondary transaction record. The scheme had a technical layer that went beyond simple money movement. Someone had engineered it who understood maritime documentation at an operational level. That someone, agents would eventually determine, was not Craig Benner. Benner had been recruited 18 months earlier by a man he knew only through a series of introductory meetings arranged by a mutual contact from his time in naval logistics. The contact had framed the arrangement as a consulting opportunity, a fee-generating passive income structure involving international vessel brokerage facilitation. Benner had asked questions. The answers had been convincing. He signed an agreement and received his first facilitation payment in September 2024. By the time NCIS pulled his records in March 2026, Benner's escrow accounts had processed $18, $4 million. Two of the other brokerage owners had similar backgrounds. Former military, former DoD vendor affiliations, familiar with the language of defense procurement, and carefully selected for exactly that familiarity. The question agents were building toward was the same one the case file circled back to repeatedly. Who had assembled this network? Who had identified these 9 specific brokerages, recruited their owners, engineered the documentation layer, coordinated the synchronized wire transfers, and done all of it while a $14 billion Taiwan arms sale sat frozen in diplomatic limbo, generating exactly the kind of diffuse payment activity that would be difficult to trace back to its source? What's most surprising about this case isn't the scale. $134 million is significant, but financial crimes at that threshold exist. What's surprising is the precision. Someone had selected these 9 firms across a period of years. This wasn't opportunism, it was architecture. The investigation that answered that question took 7 months and 3 separate federal agencies. It began with the wire transfers. It ended somewhere most of the agents involved hadn't anticipated. Operation Still Waiter was formally opened on March 18, 2026, under joint NCIS and FBI Financial Crimes Unit authority. The lead agent on the NCIS side was Diane Colwell. FBI assigned Special Agent Marcus Webb, a 15-year veteran of financial crimes work who had previously led 2 significant defense contractor fraud prosecutions out of the Washington field office. Webb's first call to Colwell lasted 47 minutes. By the end, they had agreed on 2 things: keep the investigation narrow in its initial phase, and reconstruct the financial documentation before approaching any subject. The risk was contamination. 9 brokerages meant dozens of employees, support staff, accountants, and peripheral contacts. Any premature approach, any indication that the firms were under investigation, would likely trigger fund movement and document destruction. The money in the Cayman accounts was already offshore. If the domestic layer collapsed before they understood the full network, the $134 million would vanish into a chain of holding structures that would take years to unwind through international legal channels. Webb and Colwell built a surveillance architecture designed to generate evidentiary documentation without physical contact. Court-authorized monitoring of wire transfer activity across all 9 firms. Forensic reconstruction of the vessel transaction records through USCG registry pulls and California DMV cross-references. Subpoenas to 4 correspondent banks that had served as intermediate routing points for the incoming Taiwanese transfers. The bank subpoenas came back in early April 2026. What they showed was a layering structure more complex than agents had initially modeled. The $134 million hadn't moved in a straight line from Taiwan to San Diego to the Cayman Islands. It had moved through 47 separate escrow accounts across 9 firms, with each transaction generating an authentic commercial paper trail. Invoices, purchase agreements, registration transfer documents. Each layer of documentation was consistent, internally coherent, and legally formatted. Someone had built an accounting architecture that could withstand routine audit scrutiny. Here's the part that doesn't sit right. Even now, the fictitious vessel transactions weren't just plausible. 3 of them were so well documented that when forensic accountants first reviewed them in April 2026, they initially assessed them as legitimate sales. It took secondary cross-referencing against USCG physical inspection logs to establish that the listed vessels had never left their slips. Whoever designed the documentation layer understood not just maritime registration procedure. They understood the specific audit checkpoints that financial regulators applied to vessel transaction records. One detail from the case file stuck with me after everything else. The documentation templates used across all 9 firms contained identical paragraph spacing in the vessel description sections. Not identical language. That would have been too obvious. Identical spacing. Whoever had created the base templates had used the same word processing setup. That consistency, buried across hundreds of documents, became one of the first forensic threads agents pulled. In late April 2026, Webb's team identified a pattern in the document metadata. 19 of the purchase agreements filed across different brokerages had been created using the same software license key. A licensed version of a document management platform registered to a legal support services firm in McLean, Virginia. The firm was registered under the name Harland Maritime Consulting. It had a website, a Virginia business license, and a listed address in a commercial office park. When FBI agents drove past that address on April 28, 2026, they found a shared office suite that rented mailboxes and provided a registered agent service. Harland Maritime Consulting had no actual office, no employees, no phone line that reached a human being. But it had a registered agent, and that registered agent had signed paperwork on behalf of 3 other LLCs in the previous 18 months. This is worth pausing on for a moment. What does it tell us about defense procurement oversight that a $134 million diversion scheme could operate for 18 months, touching 9 licensed firms, 4 correspondent banks, and a federal contractor clearance database, without generating a single automatic regulatory flag until a mid-level contract auditor in a shared parking lot in Chula Vista noticed a clustering pattern on a Thursday afternoon? The answer isn't flattering to the oversight architecture. And it matters now because the Taiwan Arms account isn't the only frozen procurement channel generating diffuse payment activity. The registered agent for Harland Maritime Consulting was a Virginia licensed attorney named Stephen Carver. Carver had no criminal record. He ran a legitimate registered agent practice serving approximately 340 business entities. He had signed the Harland paperwork in January 2025 without apparent knowledge of what the company was being used for. But Carver's records showed that the individual who had contracted his services was a man named David Price, an address in Alexandria, Virginia, a passport number, and a phone number that had been deactivated 6 weeks after the Harland registration was filed. David Price, agents determined within 72 hours, was a fabricated identity. The passport number was fraudulent. The Alexandria address was a UPS store. The man who had used the name David Price, however, had made one traceable mistake. When contracting Carver's services, he had paid the initial registration fee via wire transfer from an account held at a regional bank in Annapolis, Maryland. That account was registered to a real person, a retired Navy supply chain officer named Richard Falcone, age 57, of Annapolis, Maryland. Falcone had a security clearance. He had a 26-year Navy career. He had retired in 2019 and had since consulted for 2 defense logistics firms in the Beltway corridor. His financial records showed unremarkable consumer spending patterns and a modest consulting income. They also showed, beginning in October 2024, a series of recurring deposits from an LLC registered in Cyprus, amounts ranging from $18,000 to $47,000, arriving every 6 to 8 weeks. Webb called Colwell at 11:23 p.m. on May 2nd, 2026. The call lasted 19 minutes. They had their architect. The challenge was what came next. Falcone was in Annapolis. The money was in the Caymans and Cyprus. The 9 brokerages were in San Diego. The fictitious vessels were registered across California, Washington, and Oregon. The Taiwanese subcontractor, Tianlong Marine Procurement Solutions, had a Taipei address that would require State Department coordination to approach. And somewhere between Falcone and the Taiwanese source payments, there was at least one intermediary layer they hadn't yet located. Here's the take that will probably draw some pushback. The DoD vendor clearance system failed structurally here. Not because of individual negligence, but because it was never designed to flag cleared contractors who are recruited as passive participants rather than active infiltrators. Benner and the others weren't hacking into defense systems. They were operating licensed businesses that someone else was using as laundry infrastructure. The clearance review process has no mechanism for that scenario. That gap isn't hypothetical anymore. Webb's team spent the first 2 weeks of May finalizing the warrant packages. 140 agents across NCIS, San Diego, FBI San Diego, FBI Washington, and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division would need to move simultaneously across 9 physical locations in San Diego, 1 address in Annapolis, and a legal support office in McLean. On May 8, 2026, the lead prosecutor presented the warrant applications to the duty magistrate judge for the Southern District of California. The applications totaled 847 pages across all 9 brokerage warrants, plus 3 additional warrants for the Falcone residence and 2 associated storage units. The judge signed the last warrant at 9:14 p.m. Execution date, May 14, 2026. The NCIS and FBI teams began staging 24 hours in advance. The San Diego assets positioned at 2 staging areas, one in National City, one in Kearny Mesa. the Annapolis team staged out of the Baltimore field office. The McLean warrant was assigned to a 4-agent team from the FBI Washington field office. At 5:47 a.m. on May 14, 2026, all team leaders confirmed position. Then, 18 minutes before the 6:22 a.m. synchronized entry time, something went wrong. The surveillance team outside Pacific Meridian Yacht Sales on Shelter Island Drive reported activity at the building. A light had come on in the rear office section at 5:49 a.m. One individual had entered through the rear access door. He was inside. Craig Benner wasn't supposed to be there. His normal arrival time, established through 7 months of surveillance, was 8:30 a.m. Webb made the call at 6:04 a.m. Entry timeline held. The risk of Benner alerting other targets, even a text message, even a phone call, outweighed the tactical complication of an early entry. All teams were instructed. If any subject had access to a communication device in the first 60 seconds of entry, that was the priority containment issue. At 6:22 a.m., all 9 San Diego locations entered simultaneously. Pacific Meridian, 6 agents through the front entry, 2 through the rear. Benner was found at his desk, reviewing transaction files on his laptop. Agents secured the laptop within 11 seconds of entry. Benner said 3 words before being advised of his rights. "I knew it." At Harbor Gate Marine Group on Rosecrans Street, agents found the rear office locked. The key wasn't on the premises. An NCIS agent with a hydraulic door tool resolved that in 40 seconds. Inside, 3 filing cabinets containing physical escrow documentation dating to November 2024, and a secondary laptop in a desk drawer that had been factory reset within the previous 72 hours. The reset was consistent with document destruction, but it had been done imperfectly. The SSD sectors hadn't been overwritten. Digital forensics recovered 94% of the deleted files within 6 hours. At Point Loma Marine Transfers, the owner, a former Navy officer named Gary Ennis, wasn't on premises. His vehicle wasn't in the lot. Agents secured the location and issued a BOLO through San Diego PD. Ennis was located at a gas station on Harbor Drive at 6:51 a.m., approximately 14 minutes after entry. He had his phone in his hand. The call log showed 2 outgoing calls placed at 6:19 a.m. and 6:21 a.m., both to a number registered to an LLC in Nevada. Neither call had connected. The receiving number was already being disconnected by the time Ennis dialed. Ennis was taken into custody on Harbor Drive. In Annapolis, at 9:23 a.m. Eastern Time, 4 agents from the Baltimore field office approached Falcone's residence on Bay Ridge Road. Falcone answered the door in work clothes. He made no attempt to resist or flee. He asked, with notable calm, whether he was under arrest. When the agent confirmed the arrest warrant, Falcone nodded once and stepped outside without being asked. His attorney was on the phone within 6 minutes, which suggested Falcone had considered this scenario in advance. What agents found inside Falcone's residence over the following 4 hours was both expected and, in one specific regard, not. Expected, a desktop computer with encrypted partition drives. A locked filing cabinet containing documentation consistent with the Harlan Maritime Network structure. A burner phone, deactivated but not destroyed, in the bottom drawer of a bathroom vanity. Unexpected, a second set of files, physical documents, stored in a waterproof case under a floorboard in the garage. Those files contained correspondence, printed emails, and printed meeting notes between Falcone and an individual identified only by the designation TW7. The content of that correspondence indicated that Falcone had not designed the money movement architecture independently. He had received operational guidance, instructions on the documentation structure, guidance on brokerage selection, specific advice on the threshold management that kept each transfer under the automatic reporting triggers. TW7 had known how the U.S. financial reporting system worked from the inside. The correspondence pointed to someone with institutional knowledge of federal oversight mechanisms. Not someone who had researched them externally, but someone who had operated within them. The Annapolis team photographed every document in the garage cache and transmitted the images to Webb's evidence team by 1:14 p.m. Pacific time. By 3 p.m. on May 14, 2026, 11 individuals had been taken into custody across all 9 brokerage locations. 2 others associated with support roles. A bookkeeper at Pacific Meridian and an escrow administrator at a third firm called Coastal Vessel Partners were taken in for questioning and released pending further review. Gary Ennis's 2 attempted calls remained a complication. The Nevada LLC number he had dialed was traced to a registered agent address in Las Vegas, another mailbox service. The account associated with the phone number had been opened in February 2026 and had received fewer than a dozen calls, all from San Diego area codes. It was a cutout, a layer designed to absorb and redirect contact attempts without exposing a real endpoint. The cutout had been shut down before Ennis's calls connected. Someone had anticipated the raid timeline with enough advance notice to sever at least one communication thread. How they had obtained that timing is a question that, as of the date of the last available case documentation, remained unanswered. What do you think? Did the intelligence breach that tipped off the network represent a systemic failure, or was it an individual acting on information they shouldn't have had? The case file raises the question explicitly. It doesn't answer it. The forensic accounting phase of Operation Still Waiter ran from May 14th through July 3rd, 2026. 17 forensic accountants working under IRS Criminal Investigation Division authority reconstructed the full $134 million movement across 47 escrow accounts. The complete picture was more structured than the initial warrant documentation had suggested. The $134 million had entered the U.S. financial system in 3 distinct tranches: October 2024, February 2025, and November 2025. Each tranche had been split across multiple simultaneous wire transfers, each structured to stay below automatic reporting thresholds. The timing of each tranche corresponded to specific moments in the publicly documented diplomatic timeline of the frozen Taiwan arms sale. Moments when the deal's status was being publicly characterized as pending review or on pause pending consultation. The inference in the forensic accountant's preliminary report, written carefully in conditional language, was that the diversion timing had been coordinated with knowledge of the arms sale's internal review calendar, a calendar that was not public. That inference pointed somewhere beyond San Diego, beyond Annapolis, and beyond the 9 brokerages, the $134 million once it left the U.S. Escrow accounts moved through holding companies in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus. Forensic accountants traced $89, $3 million to an endpoint, a series of operational disbursements into accounts in Singapore and Hong Kong that had subsequently been closed. The remaining $44, $7 million was in Cayman structures frozen under MLAT requests filed with Cayman Islands authorities in May 2026. Recovery of those funds through international legal channels was assessed as probable but multi-year. The $89, $3 million that reached Singapore and Hong Kong before the investigation closed. That money had moved beyond practical recovery. Put yourself in Glenn Pruitt's position for a moment. A contract auditor, 11 years of routine review, a Thursday afternoon in Chula Vista. He looks at 6 wire transfers and sees a pattern. He writes 7 words of annotation and forwards a flag. He goes home. He doesn't know, at that point, that 7 months later, 140 federal agents will execute simultaneous warrants across 9 states and 2 time zones based on the thread he pulled. He doesn't know about Falcone or Harlan Maritime or the garage cache in Annapolis or the designation TW7 in a correspondence file. He just noticed something that didn't fit. The 11 individuals arrested on May 14th, 2026, faced charges including money laundering conspiracy, structuring of financial transactions, wire fraud, and conspiracy to defraud the United States. Several brokerage employees with peripheral involvement faced separate charges at lower severity levels. Craig Benner faced an additional charge of making false statements to federal investigators, stemming from a January 2026 interaction with a DCSA compliance reviewer, an interaction that had, in retrospect, been part of the investigation timeline without Benner's knowledge. Richard Falcone was charged on 9 counts, including conspiracy to commit money laundering and acting as an unregistered agent of a foreign government. The last charge added after review of the TW7 correspondence in the Annapolis garage cache suggested that Falcone had been in a directed operational relationship with a foreign principal. Gary Ennis, whose 2 attempted calls on May 14th had not connected, faced charges that included the underlying financial crimes, plus an obstruction charge tied to the attempted communication. As of the date of the last available case documentation, no individuals beyond those arrested in the May 14th operation had been charged in connection with Operation Still Waiter. The identity of TW7 had not been publicly disclosed, the source of advanced knowledge about the raid timeline. Whoever had shut down the Nevada LLC cutout phone before Ennis's calls connected had not been identified. Will this network be fully dismantled? Comment yes or no, because the case file leaves that question genuinely open, and the answer matters. 3 of the 9 brokerage firms had their licenses suspended pending the resolution of forfeiture proceedings. The remaining 6 were under federal monitoring. Several of the fictitiously listed vessels, boats whose documentation had been used in the transaction records without the owner's knowledge, required corrective registration filings to clear title clouds generated by the fraudulent sale entries. The owners of those vessels, Private individuals with no connection to the scheme discovered the title complications when they attempted routine documentation renewals. None of them had known their vessel records had been used. The Taiwan arms sale. The $14 billion procurement package whose payment processing had generated the diverted funds remained officially frozen as of July 2026. Pentagon briefings continued to characterize its status in terms consistent with diplomatic review processes. The gap between the $134 million in documented diversions and the $14 billion total package value suggested that what Operation Still Waiter had uncovered was not the complete scope of payment diversion activity. It was a detectable layer of it. How much more had moved through channels that hadn't generated a clustering anomaly on a Thursday afternoon in Chula Vista is a question the available documentation does not answer. The network, as charged, is dismantled. The architecture that made it possible. Cleared contractor recruitment, legitimate business infrastructure, layered offshore holding structures, and procurement payment timing coordination. That architecture is now a documented template. Glenn Pruitt returned to his desk at the Chula Vista field office on March 9, 2026, 3 days after submitting his flag. He had not yet heard back from NCIS. He pulled up his queue of pending audits and started reviewing the next file on his list. The case he had just triggered was already in motion. He wouldn't know the full scope of it for months. That's the part that doesn't resolve cleanly, even after everything else does. The scheme ran for 18 months, 140 agents, 7 months of work, a 47-count escrow reconstruction, international legal requests to 2 offshore jurisdictions. It started with a man at a desk who noticed 6 numbers arriving at the same time. What he couldn't flag, what no system he had access to was designed to catch, is the layer that didn't generate a clustering pattern, the layer that moved before the threshold triggers applied, the layer whose documentation was clean enough to pass the first forensic review. That layer remains unquantified. The demand that created Operation Still Waiter, money movement infrastructure that can absorb defense procurement cash without generating automatic flags, still exists. The 9 firms are closed. The 47 escrow accounts are frozen. The demand is not.